Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us as we continue to have conversations regarding immigration. For those returning, thank you so much for joining us again. And for those joining us for the very first time, welcome. It is great to see new faces with us. My name is Stephanie Gomez, and I'm the Director of Immigration Initiatives for Hispanic Federation. For a couple of months now, we have been having conversations about immigration. We started with a series on all matters related to citizenship, and now we are pivoting to a conversation about social justice issues. In order to address the inequities our communities are facing, we must also talk about it within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, the similarities, the narratives that cultivate the movements today, and how we push forward as a collective in fighting for a common cause. We encourage anyone who's watching us today to ask questions throughout the conversation. We will do our best to address those questions as we continue discussing this very important matter. So please join us in asking those questions, providing comments so that the conversation enriches. Today's guest speaker joins us from the Black Institute, a Black-led organization addressing concerns of Black families and immigrants through local policy and organizing efforts. Lucelis Ortiz is the Economic and Immigration Justice Community Organizer at the Black Institute. Of Dominican and Puerto Rican heritage and a Harlem native, Lucelis has created a footprint in New York City through her work through education justice, housing organizing, and harm reduction. Her personal motivations are providing equitable solutions to help dissolve disparities in the communities she identifies with, while also creating sustainable awareness about issues that help keep those disparities in society. She was an active leader in the affordable housing campaign from 2017 to 2019 that led to real rent reform in June of 2019 at the legislative level in New York City. She is committed to working from an anti-racist, anti-oppression lens and keenly cultivates opportunities to educate others in these pursuits. Welcome, Lucelis.
Thank you, Stephanie, for having us. It's really a privilege to be here sharing this space with you. And I would like to start out by stating what the Black Lives Matter movement is, because sometimes it gets very confusing when we're speaking about the rhetoric, especially online. So it's important to understand that Black Lives Matter seeks to end the broken windows policing, to have community oversight, to limit the use of force by police, departments to independently prosecute and investigate things within their own communities, having community representation, requiring body cameras, and legalizing filming police officers, while also having diversity trainings, the end for profit policing, demilitarization, fair police union contracts, and fair police union contracts. So it's important to know that the Black Lives Matter movement is seeking to have all of these things eradicated in order to encompass every single Black community member in the United States. And oftentimes that gets lost in the messaging.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing that. It's a great way to start the conversation and gain just an initial understanding of what the movement is all about. And with that, I think it's so important that we're having this conversation today, because so often within the realm of social justice efforts, there can be almost a sense of divide. One cause is more important than the other, or we need to address one inequity before we can address the other. And so instead of us working together, so often we end up working kind of side by side, but never really crossing paths when there is so much overlap and so much parallel. I think even within not just the activist and ally movement, but impacted communities as well may not see those common struggles. But of course, those in power are the ones kind of pinning us against one another, right? And I think that's so important that we recognize. So with that, I open up the first question, which is, what is the intersectionality between the Black Lives Matter and the immigrant rights movements?
To be very direct, the intersectionality between Black Lives Matter and the rights movement is that oftentimes when we speak about immigrants' rights, we're not only speaking about undocumented people's rights. And we often forget that there's a whole community of immigrants that are coming from different areas in the United States, or I mean, sorry, in the world, including Africa, including Southeast Asia, including Eastern Europe. And when we have such the immigrants' rights movement led by the Latinx narrative, and in specific with the undocumented narrative, we're taking away from immigrants that are coming from other areas and are not being represented. Currently, the media coverage has synonymously included immigrants' rights with undocumented people's rights. And unfortunately, undocumented populations are not even being encompassed with this rhetoric because we're focusing on domestic immigration and not so much immigration with failed student visas, for example, or work visas or other forms of immigration that lead for people to be here without documentation. And so also what we see is that the immigrants' rights movement has become highly led by the Spanish narrative. And though that's very important to Spanish-speaking immigrants, what it does is exclude a whole plethora of immigrants that are coming from various countries. So for example, in Africa, we have about 54 countries, but language accessibility and cultural competence for those populations are not as readily available for them. And so when we speak to the immigrants' rights movement, Black Lives Matter, we have to make sure that we're encompassing Black immigrants. And even when speaking to the Latinx narrative, there are Black Latinx people. And regardless of how we view them, when they're in society, they're directly affected by the same systems that have led for African American people to be led or be oppressed within the United States. So because of that, the Black Lives Matter movement is directly affecting Black immigrant diaspora because it's asking for those people to be viewed in a way where broken windows policing doesn't lead to their death. And there I must know that Amadou Diallo was one of the very first ways that the media covered largely how a Black immigrant may be mistreated within the system. And moving forward, there we have even documentation about how people are being deported, and it's usually Black Latin people that leave out of the country first because of deportation tactics, because these people are highly targeted within their own communities. So because of that, the Black Lives Matter movement is representing Black people and Black Latino diaspora as well.
Thank you so much, Lucelis. You packed so much in there that I want to dissect everything. I think you hit on so many great points. Let's talk about that last point that you mentioned with the Black immigrant community leaving first because of the immigration system, right? That not only are they being targeted because they're Black, but also because they're immigrants and that they're undocumented. So there's so many layers there that put them at a disadvantage to other immigrant community members and other individuals just across the nation. So they're already at this disadvantage, but there is that need to address their concerns and what they're being challenged with across both social movements. So that's a really great point that I think you brought up. You also talked a lot about the Latinx narrative. And I think that's a crucial point that we were even talking about before we came on this session of kind of how that dictates what, views and stereotypes within the immigrant community, within the Latinx community. So could we talk a little bit more about that? How, one, not only does the national rhetoric highly drive, the national rhetoric on immigration highly drive the conversation within the Latinx community. So how does that shape the Latinx community, but also how does that just shape how individuals in this country view immigration as a whole?
So I'd like to speak to media coverage and the way that is being manipulated to make undocumented people's rights immigrant rights, all synonymous with Latinx diaspora. And within Latinx diaspora, we have the misrepresentation of people that may be coming from Central America. Let's use Mexico for an example. They are being targeted at a much larger rate within this system of discrimination. But highly built on the Latinx narrative, access to resources within the immigrant rights movement has become very, very driven by this stereotype that most immigrants that are here are Spanish speakers. And so that means that they're limiting accessibility to the resources that the immigrant rights movement is providing to only or mainly people that speak only Spanish. And this in turn even turns away people that are Latinx, for example, if we are speaking to Belizeans, for example, or we speak to Brazilians, or even people that are from Guyana or Haiti, which are all Latin countries. But because they don't speak Spanish or are of Hispanic descent, they may not have accessibility or cultural competency for them to access resources within the immigrants' rights movement, which also limits within our own community, what resources we have, what knowledge do we have about our civic engagement and what it is that we have rights to while we're here. And so we have also contributed to the stereotype that the immigrants' rights movement only represents undocumented people. And we have this overarching stereotype that undocumented populations represent people that have crossed over through the desert, or this very, very strict narrative of what immigration looked like. And because of this stereotype, not only are Latino people being subjugated to over policing in the same style that African American people have been subjected to over policing in states like Arizona, Texas, the Midwest as well. They're being very, very much targeted by these same systems, and which is why they're being represented within Black Lives Matter as well. But we are also speaking to the invisibility of immigrants, right? Because if we're not speaking about an immigrant that is undocumented, oftentimes we forget that people that are immigrants that have residency cards, for example, don't have any rights here in terms of being able to vote, even on the municipal level. And so when we speak about the Latinx narrative and how it's shaped the immigrants' rights movement, we're making the immigrants' rights movement be singular to a specific group of people that represent the immigrant community. The immigrant community is very diverse because all of us are immigrants. And so when we speak to that, we have to remember that when we have a country of millions of people that are being composed by mainly immigrants, that we're speaking to more than one omnipresent community within the movement. And so I feel that it's a double-edged sword. It has also helped for stereotypes within Latin communities that lead for them to be over-policed, as well as stereotypes within the immigrants' rights movement, where we have lack of language access, lack of cultural competency, which leads to lack of outreach to certain immigrant groups within the movement.
Thank you, Liselis. I think those are such great points. I want to touch on a little bit more about the limitations within that this rhetoric creates within the Latinx community. This is driven by deep-rooted anti-Black racism, even within our culture, right? So it's needing to acknowledge that our community, our Latinx culture is so diverse. You mentioned that, and that is so key. I think that is front and foremost something that we need to be addressing in our conversations, and two, beginning to dismantle how that shapes our everyday lives and our narratives within the Latinx culture. This is something that I feel is so important for our families, for our neighbors, for our friends, for our communities to start talking about, if they aren't already, because it affects the broader community. And if this country is to move forward and progress, we can't just address one issue. We can't address issues separately, but we need to come together. And so with that, how can we build an inclusive leadership between all immigrants of color to change the barriers faced by immigrant populations in this nation?
So I'd like to start out with answering that question with
Lucelis seemed to have lost her for a moment, but hopefully she will be joining us in just a few. Thank you to those. I'll take this time to thank those that have joined us. Please let us know if you have any questions, comments, engage in our conversation. It is so important for all of you to be involved. I hope that so far you've been able to gather just a sliver of the importance of addressing various social justice issues, the intersectionality, the parallels, the similarities between the immigrant rights movement and the Black Lives Matter movements, how we can move forward. Hi, Lucelis.
Hi, my apologies. There
No
was
worries.
difficulties.
No worries.
And so I believe that I was answering the last question, which is
Yes.
how do we build inclusive leadership with all immigrants of color? And I'd like to firstly start by stating that we need to increase language access with cultural competency. Having language access and not having representatives that can speak the language when a person may access that resource is a limitation that leads for those community members to no longer access that resource. So first and foremost, we need to increase language accessibility while also increasing educational access and advocating for civil participation, encouraging for municipal level legalization of voting rights for immigrant community members that are contributing to their communities, not only by paying taxes, but also by working in the communities and building those communities with their children and the education systems around them. We have to also encourage civic participation by immigrant diaspora to go into their community boards and increase awareness of how a community works, whether it would be by understanding what redlining and segregation is and how the African American civil rights movement actually has helped build for rights for the immigrant community. We also have to increase accessibility of resources to all immigrants. And I have to stress that immigrants don't only come from Latin American countries in the US, they come from various continents. And one continent that has been widely neglected is Africa, with their 54 countries. We have yet to see all of their languages be encompassed. We have yet to see their rights really be spoken for within the immigrants' rights movement. And so being inclusive means increasing accessibility to all diaspora that comes here. And so we also must not forget communities that are from Southeast Asian descent, for example. And so I think that all of those factors would lead to coalition building, at least at a city level for wherever you're addressing the issue, and then would then lead for communication and community empowerment.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Lucelis. You speak on a very important point, which is the most important point, which is coming together. Coming together so that there is representation among all of our communities so that everyone has a voice and can be uplifted and share their story. I think that really goes a long way if we want to move towards change, because what we're seeing now is only one narrative, be it from those in power or how the narrative is highly driven by. And so that's not going to be encompassing enough if we want to ensure everyone is accounted for and represented in all of the disparities and inequities that our most vulnerable communities are being faced with. So thank you so much for sharing that. As I can imagine, so many others would want to know, where can we learn more about the amazing work that the Black Institute is doing, about the such crucial data that you have collected? Please tell us about where we can find more information and continue to engage in this conversation.
Well, so I would always firstly refer everyone to our website, theblackinstitute.org, where you will find various publications by our institute that speak to many issues, not only for Black people in the United States, but also immigrant immigrants in general. That being said, at TBI, we understand as a Black organization that we need to be inclusive of all immigrant communities. And that's simply because we are all immigrants, whether we be first generation, second generation, third generation. And so because that's our identity, and we recognize that in 2014, we came out with volume 1 of our publication named All Races, All Faces, where we covered immigration policy under the Obama administration. And we spoke to 46 different immigrant communities in New York City. Moving forward, on November 18th, we are releasing the second volume of All Races, All Faces, where we will be speaking about the immigration policy under the Trump administration and the composition of immigrant communities as of 2019 in New York City. Coupled with that, we will be having a roundtable talk discussion on November 18th at 6 p.m., where we will have various immigrant community leaders from different immigrant communities speak to the effects, experiences, and issues of the immigrant narrative and how that affects them in different immigrant communities within our city. And so it's a very good reference where we definitely speak to the different issues, the why, and the how. And again, I must refer everyone to our website where we also cover various other issues and explain them in thorough detail with proposed solutions. And that's the thing, having research without proposed solutions would not lead for us to, really unite each other and really work together.
Absolutely. And we just shared the cover of the latest publication that Lucelis mentioned. For more information on how you can access that publication, please visit the website, theblackinstitute.org. As Lucelis mentioned, for more information, for resources, for language on this discussion, this discourse, this narrative, please visit their website. They do an amazing job of representing and getting the information out there on all communities of color and the immigrant community. It is so important that we build each other, uplift each other, and work together towards these much needed change. And like you said, without proposing solutions, that's only half of the battle, right? So again, thank you so much, Luceli. It was a pleasure to have you today. I really enjoyed the conversation. I hope those who joined us today also enjoyed, are able to bring this back home to their communities, to their families and friends to continue the conversation. Look out for that event that Lucelis mentioned for November, where there will be a roundtable discussion. Well, they will be diving deep into these conversations. We just barely touched on the issues that our communities face. And so we hope that you will also join that conversation in November. Lucelis, any final words for those viewing us today?
So I'd first like to thank everyone for tuning in. And if they have any questions, they can reach out to us at info@theblackinstitute.org. But I'd also like to open the space up for anyone that has any extra questions that would like to follow up with us as well. We're more than happy to address these issues and collaborate on proactive solutions to uniting immigrant communities in New York City. So again, Stephanie, I'm so thankful for the space. I'm really thankful to have shared this time with you. And I look forward to having more discussions where we can actually talk deeply about these issues and not just gloss over them.
Absolutely. Thank you. And just to let you know, Lucelis, we did have a few folks comment very positive feedback about what they heard today. So I think this was a great start and we should continue to have these conversations. So hopefully we'll meet again soon. Until then, thank you all for viewing and stay tuned. Next week, we will have a conversation about know your rights for immigrant protesters who want to show up in solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement and the protests. So stay tuned. That session will be in Spanish. Same time next week, Wednesday, October 21st at 4 p.m. Hopefully you will join us so that you feel empowered and confident in showing up at these protests, which is so important, that we show that there needs to be change, that we will not rest until we we see justice for our community members. So thank you all. And until next time, bye everyone.
Goodbye. Thank you.